Although Linda McCartney occasionally ventured into the studio with the Beatles, she and Mary Hopkins sang harmonies on Let It Be. It wasn't until Paul's strictly solo McCartney album that her presence became musically significant. Released on April 17, 1970, the popular, largely homespun record showed that even on his own, Paul was still a force to be reckoned with. Despite his role in the extended dissolution of the Beatles, his solo effort, complete with album graphics and backing vocals by Linda, nevertheless reached a wide audience, curious to see what kind of magic an individual Beatle could conjure. Obviously, the commercial acceptance of the work was extremely important to Paul, who, now that his old group seemed almost certain to split forever, was naturally anxious about the future. Just to make sure everyone knew exactly where he stood, Peter Brown at Apple sent over a list of over 40 questions for him to answer regarding his decision to break away from the band. This, along with a blow-by-blow account of the making of McCartney, was then released to the world media, in the hope of softening the blow of the Beatles' final goodbye to the fervent fandom. The net effect, however, was to point the finger at Paul, as the originator of the Beatles' demise as a group. After the initial shock of the breakup, and his searing estrangement from John, Paul picked up the pieces of his life and began to think about getting back to work. With no band and no great desire to rush out and start one, working with his new wife seemed the simplest and best alternative. The McCartneys' first real joint effort was the heartfelt single, Another Day, issued on February 19, 1971. The story of a young girl lost in a maze of one-night stands and broken dreams, the song was a compassionate statement about the displaced and alienated in society. An auspicious start to Paul's solo career, the record reached all the way to the #1 spot on the British charts. Flying to New York in January for a visit with Linda's family, the couple decided to lay down some tracks for a new album. Auditions were secretly held in a dingy Manhattan rehearsal hall to try to find some local musical talent to play with them in supporting roles. One of those who came along to the invitation-only proceedings was New York session drummer Denny Seiwell. Seiwell remembers some third-rate equipment haphazardly set up in one corner, complemented by the absolutely shoddiest kit he had ever seen. A lot of the boys were really put out at being asked to audition, he remembers. Paul just told me to play, as he didn't have a guitar. Paul wanted more than a drummer. He was looking for a certain attitude, too. Anyway, I just played. I always say that if you can't get it on by yourself, you can't get it on with anyone. Much to the drummer's surprise, he was informed the next day that he had blitzed the other 8 percussionists invited to perform and was in. Paul recalls his reason for settling on the towering 6'2.5" native Pennsylvanian. Well, actually is his tom-toms. That may not sound like much to anyone who is not a musician, but if you see a drummer playing tom-toms, you learn a lot about him. With Seiwell in place, the McCartneys needed to locate a couple of top-flight guitarists, who soon presented themselves in the persons of David Spinoza and Hugh McCracken. Only 21 at the time of the audition, Spinoza was already a recording studio legend of sorts, turning pro at the age of just 17. In those days, the standard fee was a mere $90 for a 3-hour session, but the super talented Spinoza was generally taking home more than $1,500 for the same work. Among the many artists he played with over the years were John Lennon, Yoko Ono, Freda Payne, Carly Simon, and B.B. King. Spinoza later recounted the humble beginnings of his totally unexpected stint as the former Fab's first guitarist. All I remember is getting a phone call from Linda identifying herself as Mrs. McCartney. And I said, "Who?" She said, "My husband would like to meet you." So I said, "Did I ever work with your husband before?" Finally she said, "This is Linda McCartney, and my husband is Paul McCartney." Like I was supposed to know Paul McCartney was calling my house. She didn't make it clear what she wanted me for. I thought it was a meeting or a recording session, but it turned out to be an audition. Cabbing it down to a crummy 45th Street loft a few days later, Spinoza was surprised to learn that the grueling tryouts had already been going on for a full 3 days before he arrived. You had to be called. You couldn't just walk in off the street with your guitar. Paul played a blues, a solo, some folk, and said he wanted me to do that. So I played everything, and then he just says, "Sorry, I couldn't spend more time with you, but I have a lot of people to see." As soon as I got home, the phone rang and Linda wanted me to do the sessions the following week. Booking time at Phil Ramone's A&R Studios, the totally unrehearsed quintet charged ahead, recording no less than 21 of Paul and Linda's new tunes. According to reports, the sessions started out smoothly enough, but soon ran into difficulty when the McCartneys began spacing out on the day-to-day business of organizing and overseeing the dates. Spinoza recalls, "I told them I couldn't keep every week open because when McCartney goes back to England, there are other people that call me, and they are going to keep me eating, not him. Although I'd love to do his sessions. I said I could make 2 of the days, but not all 5. And Linda got very indignant. I got vibrations like, "It's Paul McCartney's session. You're supposed to keep your life open indefinitely." She really speaks for him and handles all the business. She wouldn't let me talk directly to sort out what he wanted. Musically, Spinoza felt right at home playing with the creative and orderly Paul, but complained that his well-known penchant for perpetually trying to push the river did tend to make the others feel rather like second-class citizens. It is a charge that has been leveled against the sometimes annoyingly perfectionistic musician since his early days in Liverpool. "I think the whole album was done in the same format as the McCartney album," says Spinoza. "Only we played the parts for him. There was no freedom. We were told exactly what to play. Paul sang us the parts he wanted and the tune developed as we went along. We made suggestions, but he rarely took them. And if he did, always modified it into a Paul McCartney-sounding thing." For David Spinoza, perhaps the least attractive feature of playing with Paul was the nearly constant presence of Linda, who, apart from being Paul's wife, didn't seem to have a very productive reason for being around at all. Linda didn't have much to do in the studio. She just took care of the kids. They brought the whole family every day to the studio. If he was there until 4 in the morning, everybody stayed. I thought to a certain degree it was distracting. I don't know what Linda did in the studio apart from sit there and make comments on what she thought was good and bad. I mean, she can sing fine, like any girl that worked in a high school glee club. In the end, Spinoza was politely let go by Linda, who rang him up one evening and told him not to bother coming in the next day, as they were doing some last-minute vocal overdubs, and he wouldn't be needed. He half expected them to phone in a few days and invite him back, but the call never came. His thinly veiled disapproval of Mrs. McCartney perhaps a little more obvious than he'd imagined. Still, Spinoza was happy to have been part of the sessions, and remembers the experience today with mixed emotions. Working with Paul was fun, in as much as it was good to see how he works and where he's coming from. But as a musician, there was no challenge. McCartney is definitely a songwriter, not a musician, but he composes beautiful tunes. In the studio, he's incredibly prompt and businesslike. No smoking pot, no drinks or carrying on, nothing. Just straight ahead. He came in at 9 every morning. We'd listen to what we'd just done the day before, and then it was 8 hours of just playing. He's not a very loose cat. He just wants to make good music. The arduous, extended sessions eventually reached the public as Ram, one of Paul's most innovative and original works. 2 other musicians, Ron Carter and Richard Davis, also participated, playing bass on several of the album's 12 eccentric tracks. The McCartneys also enlisted the aid of the New York Philharmonic, whose lush string section enriched the songs Uncle Albert, Admiral Halsey, The Backseat of My Car, and the haunting Long-Haired Lady. In addition to the sessions at A&R, the tapes were further refined at Columbia Studios, with final mixing and sweetening carried out at Sound Recording in Los Angeles. Altogether, 6 tracks were credited to Paul and Linda McCartney, and 6 solely to Paul. Unfortunately, bigwigs over at the Beatles' old publishing house, Northern Songs, and Sir Lou Grade of ATV, found it difficult to accept that the musically untrained and unaccomplished Linda should be listed as a co-composer alongside the great Paul McCartney, and on that basis, slapped the couple with a whopping $1 million lawsuit in defense of their interests in the former Beatles publishing. As it stood, on those 6 tracks, Linda was entitled to collect half the writer's royalties, which normally would have gone entirely to Paul to be shared with his publisher. Mrs. McCartney, however, was not one of Northern's clients, and therefore that little bit of flesh would have been denied to them, an intolerable prospect for the already well-fed corporate conglomerate. Paul explains. I said, well, look, if my wife is actually saying, change that, or I like that better than that, then I'm using her as a collaborator. I mean, John never had any input on The Long and Winding Road, and Yoko still collects royalties on it. You gotta flow with these things. The joke at the time was that Linda was the only one getting paid in our household, because we were all held up with Apple being subject to litigation. I wasn't seeing any money. Every businessman I had ever known was suing me. I felt, I'm damned if she's not going to get paid for it. I'll put in a bill for her services. They weren't major checks, but it was the only money we were seeing because she was the only one free of all the contracts in our house. With no wish to further legally entangle himself, Paul agreed to film a television special for ATV in exchange for their dropping the suit. Additionally, Linda would get to keep her royalties. Released in Great Britain on May 21st, 1971, Ram was not the hit Paul felt he needed in the face of the flack he had been subjected to for initiating the disbanding of the Beatles. Critics were particularly harsh. Writing for Rolling Stone, John Landau famously lambasted the album as incredibly inconsequential, and accused Paul of inserting himself into a fantasy world. Others derided the record as lightweight and self-indulgent, a retreat from the cultural gravity of the Beatles' final works. For Paul, it was a dispiriting blow. He had poured himself into Ram, not only as a songwriter but as a producer, crafting its layered arrangements alongside Linda. The biting track Too Many People didn't go unnoticed by John, who took offense at what he perceived as veiled jabs at himself and Yoko. He said too many people preaching practices, John recalled later. That was a little dig at me. Paul admitted years later, I was looking at my fellow Beatles and getting hurt and annoyed by what I felt was their attitude towards me, so I wrote Ram to get it off my chest. I did feel that certain people were getting a bit preachy, you should do this. I felt that was a bit much. He clarified that the song wasn't entirely about John, but parts of it were, what he called a little dig. Paul's grievances with the other Beatles, particularly John and George, were all over Ram, even if they were buried between sun-drenched harmonies and playful melodies. On the surface, it sounded like a lighthearted album, but underneath the surface, there was tension, sarcasm, and frustration. The lyric, "You took your lucky break and broke it in two," also seemed pointed. While Paul insisted it could be applied more broadly, John took it personally and responded in kind. That same year, John fired back with How Do You Sleep on his Imagine album. The venom was unmistakable. The only thing you done was yesterday, and since you've gone, you're just another day. A line suggested by Alan Klein himself. It was a brutal retaliation. Paul was stunned by the intensity of John's attack, especially given how raw their relationship already was. The song featured George on slide guitar, adding salt to the wound. Paul now felt ganged up on by two of his former bandmates. I thought it was really hurtful, Paul said years later. That bit about the only thing you done was yesterday. I mean, I had quite a few hits after that, but Paul wasn't entirely innocent in the feud. Even songs like Three Legs on Ram seemed to allude to the fractured Beatles dynamic. When I thought you was my friend, but you let me down, put my heart around the bend. Many interpreted the three legs metaphor as a reference to the other three Beatles abandoning him, or conspiring against him during the band's messy breakup and legal wranglings. In fact, Paul had been increasingly frustrated by the way he was portrayed in the press and by others. He'd resisted the idea of manager Alan Klein taking control of the Beatles' business affairs, instead of proposing his father-in-law Lee Eastman. Others had sided against him, and Paul eventually sued the band just to extricate himself from the legal partnership, a move that made him appear as the villain in the public eye. With Ram, Paul tried to reclaim the narrative, albeit in an oblique and artful way. The album's homemade aesthetic and domestic themes were both a retreat and a rebuke. He had left the chaos of Apple and the courtroom behind, and was now focused on building a new life with Linda. This time, however, he figured it would work out better if he took the plunge and formed his own group, something that had been in the offing for some time. Originally, he had wanted to call his new band Turpentine, but was subsequently talked out of the idea by an indignant fan. Then it was the Dazzlers, but that too was dropped at the last minute in favor of the more commercially viable Wings. According to popular legend, the inspiration behind the name came to Paul as he silently prayed for the safe arrival of his second daughter, Stella, asking that the child be delivered on the wings of an angel. Paul adds, "Linda and I were having our second baby. It was a difficult pregnancy, and I had to be with her a lot. So I got myself a camp bed and kept in the hospital. Eventually, one of the matrons told me I couldn't sleep there, so I said, 'We're gonna use another hospital.' So we looked around until we found one that would have us. Our baby was in intensive care. It was dodgy at the time, so rather than just sitting around twiddling my thumbs, I was thinking about hopeful names for a new group, and somehow this uplifting idea of Wings came to me." In the next chapter, we'll uncover the rocky beginnings of Wings. If you liked this video and want to see more, click the like button and comment below what your favorite track from Ram is. Also, consider joining our member program. For only $1.99, you can access exclusive perks like members-only videos, polls, and more. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.